Henry Voss, a 65-year-old retired mechanic, lived alone in a sagging clapboard house on the edge of Millfield, Ohio. The town was a speck of faded Americana, rusted grain silos, a diner with flickering neon, and streets that smelled of damp asphalt after the frequent rains. Henry's days were a rhythm of routine: coffee brewed in a stained pot, the hum of a radio spitting static, and evenings spent in a recliner, flipping through yellowed car magazines. His hands, calloused from decades turning wrenches, still fidgeted as if searching for a bolt to tighten. Lately, though, a heaviness clung to him, a vague guilt over a life of missed chances, a son he hadn't spoken to in years, a wife who left when the silence grew too loud. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Henry was scrubbing dishes, the kitchen air thick with the sour tang of mildew from a leak he'd never fixed. His left ear itched, a sharp, insistent prickle deep inside the canal. He rubbed at it with a soapy finger, wincing as the sensation flared, like a needle jabbing beneath the skin. "Damn allergies," he muttered, blaming the damp autumn air. The itch didn't fade, though. It pulsed, warm and stubborn, as if something were lodged there. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the feeling, but it only deepened, a faint throb that seemed to hum in time with his heartbeat. By afternoon, the itch had become a distraction. At the diner, where he met his old friend Carl for coffee, Henry kept tilting his head, pressing a finger to his ear. The diner smelled of burnt grease and syrup, the air heavy with the clatter of plates. Carl, a wiry man with a smoker's rasp, noticed. "You all right, Hank? Look like you're trying to shake a bee out of your head." Henry forced a chuckle, waving it off. "Just an itch. Probably got some wax stuck in there." But the itch wasn't just an itch anymore. It felt alive, a crawling sensation that made his skin prickle with unease. That night, Henry stood in his bathroom, the fluorescent light buzzing like a trapped fly. The mirror showed a tired man, gray stubble, sagging jowls, eyes shadowed with fatigue. He tilted his head, peering into his left ear. There, just inside the canal, was a small, red bump, like a pimple. It glistened under the light, unnaturally shiny, as if coated in oil. He touched it with a Q-tip, expecting pain, but instead felt a strange warmth, like pressing against a heated stone. The itch flared, and for a moment, he swore he felt something shift beneath the bump, a tiny, deliberate twitch. Henry laughed nervously, the sound hollow in the cramped bathroom. "Getting old imagining things," he told himself, but his hands trembled as he set the Q-tip down. He turned off the light, ignoring the faint wet smell that seemed to linger near his ear, like damp earth after a storm. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of rusting engines and something skittering in the dark. Around 3 a.m., he jolted awake, heart pounding. The itch was gone, replaced by a faint, rhythmic scratching, like claws scraping bone. It came from deep inside his ear, and as he lay there, frozen, he could have sworn he heard a faint, chittering sound, like an insect trapped in a jar. Henry Voss woke to the smell of rain and something sharper metallic, like pennies left too long in a damp drawer. The air in his Millfield, Ohio, home was heavy, the kind of damp that clung to the walls and made the floorboards groan. His left ear throbbed, not with pain but with a strange pulsing warmth that seemed to radiate into his jaw. The scratching from last night lingered in his memory, a sound so faint he half convinced himself it was a dream. But when he touched his ear, the red bump inside felt larger, its surface taut and slick, like a grape about to burst. He shivered, his fingers coming away with a faint smear of something sticky, pale yellow, with a sour tang that made his stomach lurch. Henry tried to stick to his routine. He brewed coffee, the machine gurgling like a clogged drain, and flipped on the radio, which spat static over a country song. But the normalcy felt fragile, like a cracked windshield ready to spiderweb. At the diner, he sat across from Carl, the air thick with the scent of fried eggs and stale cigarette smoke. Henry kept his head tilted slightly, hiding his ear, but the itch had returned, sharper now, like tiny claws scraping inside his skull. Carl squinted at him, his fork paused mid-air. "Hank, you're lookin' rough. You sick or something?" Henry forced a grin, his voice tight. "Just didn't sleep well. Old age, you know." But his hand drifted to his ear, pressing against the bump, which pulsed under his touch, warm and alive. Back home, Henry avoided the bathroom mirror. The fluorescent light buzzed too loudly, and the thought of seeing that bump again made his skin crawl. Instead, he sat in his recliner, the leather creaking under his weight, and tried to focus on a car magazine. The words blurred, his attention snagged by the sensation in his ear, a faint wriggling, like a thread caught in a breeze. He shook his head, but the feeling persisted, accompanied by a wet, clicking sound, like a beetle scuttling over glass. His heart thudded, a cold sweat prickling his neck. "Stop it," he muttered, pressing his palm against his ear. The bump seemed to push back, a deliberate nudge that sent a jolt of nausea through him. Desperate for distraction, Henry walked to the corner store, the autumn air heavy with the smell of wet leaves and exhaust. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, wrinkled her nose as he approached. "You okay, Mr. Voss? Smells like, I dunno, something chemical." Henry froze, his hand brushing his ear. The sticky discharge had left a faint stain on his collar, yellowish and glistening, with a sharp, acrid odor like burnt rubber. "Spilled some cleaner," he lied, hurrying out with a pack of batteries he didn't need. On the walk home, he caught his reflection in a shop window. His ear looked swollen, the skin around it grayish, like meat left too long in the fridge. The bump was visible now, a bulging knot that seemed to shift slightly as he stared. That night, Henry sat in his kitchen, the radio off, the only sound the drip of the leaky faucet and the distant patter of rain. He held a flashlight and a hand mirror, his hands trembling as he angled the light into his ear. The bump had grown, its surface cracked and oozing a thin, milky fluid that smelled of rust and decay. He prodded it with a Q-tip, wincing as the tip sank slightly, as if the bump were hollow. Then, a sharp, skittering movement. Something inside the bump darted, a quick, deliberate twitch that made him drop the mirror. It shattered on the tile, the sound swallowed by the pounding in his chest. He leaned closer to the flashlight, his breath shallow, and saw it. A tiny, black shape, no bigger than a grain of rice, wriggling beneath the thin membrane of the bump. It wasn't wax or a pimple. It was alive. Henry stumbled back, his chair scraping the floor. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the stench of his own ear, metallic, sour, wrong. He grabbed a pair of tweezers, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. He didn't want to look, didn't want to know, but he couldn't stop himself. He angled the tweezers toward the bump, his breath hitching as he pinched the swollen skin. A sharp pain lanced through his ear, followed by a wet pop. A bead of dark, viscous fluid welled up, carrying with it a smell so foul, rotting meat mixed with ammonia, that he gagged. And then, in the beam of the flashlight, he saw it, a tiny, segmented leg, black and glistening, curling out of the wound. It twitched once, then retreated, as if sensing the light. Henry dropped the tweezers, his vision swimming. The room spun, the drip of the faucet now a deafening pulse. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, the chittering, scratching, crawling sound that wasn't just in his ear anymore but inside his head, his bones, his blood. And then, faint but unmistakable, he heard it, a low, rasping noise, like a whisper made of static, coming from the wound. It wasn't words, not yet, but it carried a weight, a presence, as if something inside him was waking up. Henry Voss hadn't slept in 2 days. The air in his Millfield, Ohio, home was thick with the stench of decay, a rancid mix of rust and rotting fruit that seemed to seep from his left ear. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly, each second a hammer against his skull. The bump, no, the thing, in his ear had grown, splitting the skin into jagged, weeping fissures. The oozing fluid, now a sickly gray-green, left stains on his pillow, his collar, his fingers. It smelled like a gas station spill, chemical and wrong, and when he touched the wound, it pulsed with a heat that wasn't his own. Worse was the sensation, a constant wriggling, like a worm burrowing through wet soil, deep inside his ear canal. Henry avoided mirrors, but the compulsion to look was overwhelming. In the bathroom, under the flickering fluorescent light, he tilted his head and held a flashlight to his ear. The sight made his knees buckle. The bump had ruptured into a crater, its edges black and curling like burnt paper. Inside, a glistening mass throbbed, threaded with tiny, hair-like tendrils that twitched in the light. They moved with purpose, curling and uncurling, as if tasting the air. A bead of pus, thick and oily, slid down his neck, carrying a sharp metallic tang that made his throat constrict. He gagged, the taste of bile mixing with a faint, coppery aftertaste that lingered in his mouth, as if the thing in his ear were leaking into him. He tried to keep up appearances. At the diner, he sat hunched in a corner booth, a baseball cap pulled low to hide the swelling. The air was heavy with grease and coffee, but all he could smell was the sour rot from his ear. Carl, his only friend, leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing. "Hank, you smell like a damn landfill. You see a doctor yet?" Henry's laugh was brittle, his voice hoarse. "It's just an infection. Got some cream for it." He hadn't bought any cream. He hadn't done anything but sit in his house, listening to the scratching, the chittering, that seemed to echo in Roswell. The town was gray and damp, the diner's windows fogged with condensation, and outside, a crow perched on a streetlight, its beady eyes fixed on Henry as he shuffled home. Back at his house, the walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the damp, earthy smell of mildew and the ever-present reek from his ear. He tried cleaning the wound with peroxide, but it hissed and bubbled, the tendrils inside squirming as if angered by the intrusion. The pain was sharp, like a hot needle, but worse was the sound, a low, wet clicking, like teeth gnashing in the dark. He wrapped a bandage around his head, but the fabric grew damp, stained with a viscous fluid that smelled of ammonia and decay. His hands shook as he changed it, the bandage sticking slightly to the raw flesh. He couldn't go on like this. The thought of a doctor seeing it, filled him with dread, but the alternative was worse. He booked an appointment at Millfield Small Clinic, his voice trembling as he spoke to the receptionist. The clinic was a squat brick building, its waiting room smelling of antiseptic and stale magazines. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a sickly pallor over the peeling linoleum. Dr. Hargrove, a tired man with graying hair, frowned as Henry unwrapped the bandage. "Looks like a bad infection," he said, his voice clipped. "Could be a cyst or abscess. We'll need to drain it." Henry nodded, his throat tight, unable to mention the wriggling, the tendrils, the whispers that woke him at night. The doctor prescribed antibiotics and scheduled a procedure for the next day. Henry left with a bottle of pills, their rattle in his pocket a hollow promise of relief. That night, Henry's dreams were fevered, fragmented. He saw a dark, endless tunnel, its walls pulsing like living flesh, lined with thousands of tiny, skittering legs. A voice, not his own, rasped in the darkness, wordless but heavy with intent, like a warning or a claim. He woke drenched in sweat, the bandage on his ear soaked through with a foul, grayish ooze that smelled of wet iron and mold. His fingers hovered over it, afraid to touch. The scratching in his ear was louder now, a relentless skittering that vibrated through his jaw, his teeth, his bones. He stumbled to the bathroom, the mirror fogged with condensation, and forced himself to look. The crater in his ear had widened, its edges ragged and black, and in its center, something gleamed, a single, unblinking eye, small and glossy, staring back at him. It blinked, slow and deliberate, and the whispering grew clearer, a hiss that formed his name. "Henry! Henry!" He screamed, the sound swallowed by the patter of rain outside, the drops heavy and metallic against the window. The eye moved, shifting slightly as if tracking him, and the tendrils around it pulsed in time with his racing heart. The room spun, the air thick with the stench of his own decay, and he knew with a sickening certainty, that whatever was inside him wasn't just alive. It was awake. Henry Voss hadn't left his Millfield, Ohio, home in 3 days. The air inside was stifling, thick with the stench of rot and something sharper, like scorched wiring, emanating from his left ear. The house groaned under the weight of endless rain, the roof leaking in slow, rhythmic drips that echoed the relentless skittering in his skull. The wound in his ear had become a gaping maw, its edges blackened and peeling like old paint, oozing a viscous gray-green sludge that smelled of ammonia and spoiled meat. The eye he'd seen last night, small, glossy, unblinking, haunted him, its gaze burned into his memory. It wasn't just watching him, it felt like it knew him, peeling back the layers of his guilt, his loneliness, his shame over a life spent running from his failures. Henry avoided the bathroom mirror, taping a towel over it to escape his own reflection. But the compulsion to look, to understand, was unbearable. In the dim kitchen, lit only by a flickering bulb, he held a flashlight and a cracked hand mirror, his hands trembling as he angled the light into his ear. The crater had deepened, its interior a writhing mass of thread-like tendrils, black and slick, curling like worms in a baked can. The eye was still there, larger now, its pupil a pinpoint of gleaming black, surrounded by a sickly yellow iris. It swiveled slightly, tracking the light, and the tendrils pulsed in response, their movements synchronized with a low, chittering hum that vibrated through his jaw. A bead of oily pus slid down his neck, leaving a trail that burned like acid, its stench so foul, rancid fat and burnt plastic, that he retched, the taste of metal coating his tongue. He couldn't go to the diner anymore. Carl had called twice, leaving voicemails Henry deleted without listening. The thought of anyone seeing him, smelling him, was unbearable. His ear was impossible to hide now, the swelling distorting his face, pulling the skin taut and gray. He wore a knit cap, pulled low, but the bandage beneath was soaked, the fabric clinging to the raw flesh with a wet, sucking sound. The antibiotics from Dr. Hargrove sat untouched on the counter, their promise of help as useless as the rain-soaked prayers he muttered in the dark. The thing in his ear wasn't an infection. It was alive and it was growing. Desperation drove him to act. In the kitchen, the air heavy with the reek of his own decay, Henry set out a towel, a bowl of hot water, and a paring knife. His hands shook as he sterilized the blade with rubbing alcohol, the sharp smell briefly masking the rot. He didn't want to do this, but the thought of that eye, those tendrils, spreading further was worse. He leaned over the sink, the faucet dripping like a metronome, and pressed the knife to the edge of the wound. The pain was immediate, a white-hot lance that made his vision blur, but he pushed deeper, cutting into the blackened flesh. A gush of dark, syrupy fluid poured out, splattering the sink with a hiss, its smell so acrid, burnt hair and bile, that he gagged. The tendrils writhed, curling around the blade like living vines, and then he saw it, a segmented, insect-like body, black and glistening, emerging from the wound. Its legs, 6, maybe 8, twitched frantically, each tipped with a barbed claw that sank into his skin. Henry screamed, dropping the knife. The creature retreated, burrowing back into the crater with a wet, slurping sound. Blood and pus mixed in the sink, the stench overwhelming, like a slaughterhouse left to fester. He stumbled back, his chair crashing to the floor, and clutched his ear. The pain was gone, replaced by a sickening warmth, as if the thing were settling deeper, claiming more of him. The chittering grew louder, no longer confined to his ear but resonating in his chest, his bones, a relentless hum that felt like it was rewriting his pulse. And then came the voice, rasping, guttural, not quite words but heavy with meaning, like a curse hissed in a language he didn't know. It called his name, Henry, Henry, each syllable a needle in his mind. He staggered to the living room, the walls seeming to pulse, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and metal. The radio, unplugged, crackled to life, spitting static that mimicked the chittering in his head. Outside, the rain fell harder, the drops glinting like oil under the streetlights. Henry collapsed into his recliner, his breath ragged, and caught his reflection in the dark TV screen. It wasn't his face. The left side was distorted, swollen, the skin splitting to reveal a mass of writhing tendrils that pulsed in time with the eye in his ear. The reflection blinked, but he hadn't. Its mouth moved, forming a lipless grin, and the voice in his head grew clearer, whispering, "We are one now." Henry clawed at his face, his nails drawing blood, but the reflection only smiled wider. The room spun, the walls oozing a faint, grayish slime that smelled of his wound. The thing in his ear wasn't just alive. It was him, or becoming him, and the thought drove a spike of terror through his heart. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body felt heavy, foreign, as if it no longer belonged to him. The last thing he saw, as his vision blurred, was the reflection reaching out, its tendrils curling toward him through the glass. This part pushes Henry's transformation to a horrifying peak, with vivid, grotesque imagery and a suffocating atmosphere that mirrors his psychological collapse. The cliffhanger, the reflection claiming him, deepens the sense of dread and loss of identity. Henry Voss sat in the sterile waiting room of Millfield's clinic, the air sharp with antiseptic and the faint, lingering stench of his own ear. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, clinical glow that made his skin look gray, almost translucent. His left ear was hidden beneath a fresh bandage, but the damp fabric clung to the raw, pulsing wound, leaking a sickly yellow fluid that smelled of burnt rubber and decay. The thing inside him, the insect, the creature, had retreated after his desperate attempt to cut it out, but its presence lingered, a constant wriggling deep in his ear canal, like a maggot burrowing through rot. The chittering voice, that rasping Henry, Henry, had quieted, but it echoed in his dreams, weaving through nightmares of tunnels lined with writhing legs and eyes that blinked in the dark. He hadn't wanted to come here. The thought of Dr. Hargrove seeing the eye, the tendrils, filled him with a shame so deep it felt like drowning. But the reflection in the TV screen, its lipless grin, its reaching tendrils, had pushed him past fear into desperation. He couldn't live like this, not with his body turning traitor, not with the sense that he was becoming something else. The clinic was his last hope, a fragile thread of normalcy in a world that felt increasingly wrong. The waiting room was nearly empty, save for an old woman coughing into a handkerchief, the sound wet and grating, like the chittering in his head. The walls were too white, the air too clean, but beneath it all, Henry caught a whiff of something foul, his own ear, seeping through the bandage, tainting the sterile air with its metallic rot. Dr. Hargrove's office was small, cluttered with charts and a faint smell of coffee gone stale. The doctor, his face lined with fatigue, frowned as Henry unwrapped the bandage. The wound was a nightmare, a jagged crater, its edges black and curling, oozing a thick, gray-green pus that glistened under the light. The tendrils were visible now, thin and black, twitching like spider legs, and the eye, small, glossy, unblinking, stared out from the center, its pupil dilating as if studying the doctor. Hargrove's breath caught, his professionalism cracking. Jesus, Henry, this isn't normal. He leaned closer, his gloved hands trembling, and the tendrils recoiled, sinking deeper into the wound with a wet, sucking sound. The smell, ammonia, rust, and something alive, made Hargrove gag, his face paling. "We need to operate. Now." The procedure room was a sterile bubble, all white tile and gleaming steel, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls were holding their breath. Henry lay on the table, his heart pounding, the sedative making his limbs heavy but not dulling the dread. The overhead light buzzed, its hum blending with the faint chittering in his ear, a sound that seemed to pulse in time with the machines. Hargrove and a nurse worked quickly, their faces masked, but Henry saw the fear in their eyes. The scalpel bit into his ear, and he gasped, the pain sharp but fleeting, drowned by a sudden warmth that spread through his skull. A loud crack echoed, like a walnut splitting, and a gush of dark, viscous fluid sprayed across the table, splattering the nurse's mask. The smell was unbearable, burnt hair, rotting meat, and something chemical, like gasoline left in the sun. The tendrils thrashed, curling around the scalpel, and the eye blinked rapidly, its gaze darting as if in panic. Hargrove muttered something under his breath, his hands shaking as he extracted a mass, black, segmented, the size of a grape, with legs that twitched feebly. It pulsed once, then went still, but as he dropped it into a metal tray, it burst, releasing a cloud of acrid grayish vapor that stung Henry's eyes and throat. The nurse coughed, stepping back, and the room filled with a low, buzzing hum, like a swarm trapped in a jar. Hargrove stitched the wound, his movements hurried, and bandaged it tightly. "It's out," he said, his voice unsteady. "Whatever it was, it's gone. You'll need to stay on antibiotics, and we'll monitor you." But his eyes avoided Henry's, and the air still carried the faint, sour reek of the creature. Henry returned home, the bandage fresh but already damp, the wound aching with a dull, persistent heat. His house felt different. Too quiet, the air heavy with the smell of rain and mildew, but cleaner somehow, as if the creature's stench had faded. He sat in his recliner, the leather creaking, and tried to believe it was over. The chittering was gone, the wriggling stilled, but his body felt wrong, heavy, like a suit that didn't fit. He avoided the mirror, afraid of what he might see, but the urge to check was overwhelming. In the bathroom, the fluorescent light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe. He peeled back the bandage, wincing at the tug of raw flesh. The wound was smaller, stitched shut, but the skin around it was gray, puckered, and faintly warm, like a bruise that hadn't healed. No tendrils, no eye. Just a scar, jagged and raw. For the first time in weeks, Henry slept through the night, dreamless, the silence almost too loud. He went to the diner the next day, forcing himself to face Carl, who clapped him on the shoulder and said he looked better. But Henry felt the weight of eyes on him, the waitress, the old man at the counter, as if they could sense something off. The coffee tasted metallic, the air thick with grease and something else, something faint and sour, like the ghost of the creature's stench. He smiled, nodded, but his hands trembled, and he kept touching the bandage, checking for movement. That night, as he lay in bed, the rain pattering outside, Henry felt it. A faint itch, not in his ear but deeper, behind his left eye. It was subtle, like a feather brushing his brain, but it grew, sharpening into a prickle that made his vision blur. He sat up, heart racing, and stumbled to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and metal. He wiped it clear, his breath hitching, and leaned close. His left eye was bloodshot, the pupil slightly dilated, but as he stared, it twitched, a quick, unnatural flicker. And then he heard it, a faint, chittering whisper, not in his ear but inside his skull, calling his name. Henry! Henry! This part offers Henry a fleeting hope of salvation, only to shatter it with the parasite's lingering presence, now spreading to his eye. The vivid sensory details and oppressive atmosphere maintain the horror, while the cliffhanger deepens the dread of an inescapable transformation. Henry Voss stood in his Millfield, Ohio, kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked wood and the faint, lingering tang of metal that never seemed to leave him. 2 weeks had passed since the operation, and the bandage on his ear was gone, replaced by a jagged scar that puckered the grayish skin like a badly sewn quilt. The wound no longer oozed, and the chittering whispers had faded to a dull hum, a background noise he could almost ignore. His house, once a claustrophobic prison of mildew and rot, felt quieter now, the dripping faucet silenced by a hasty repair, the walls no longer seeming to pulse with malice. But the calm was fragile, a thin veneer over a dread that clung to him like damp cloth, cold and inescapable. Henry had returned to the diner, forcing himself to reclaim some shred of normalcy. The air there was thick with grease and coffee, the neon sign outside flickering in the gray autumn light. Carl greeted him with a grin, his smoker's rasp unchanged, but his eyes lingered on Henry's scar, a flicker of unease passing over his face. "Lookin' almost human again, Hank," he joked, but the words felt hollow, and Henry's smile was tight, his fingers brushing the scar absent-mindedly. The waitress poured his coffee with a quick glance, her nose wrinkling slightly, as if catching a whiff of something sour. Something Henry couldn't smell anymore but knew was there, buried in his skin. He sipped the coffee, its metallic aftertaste coating his tongue, and told himself it was just his imagination. The itch behind his left eye had grown, subtle at first but now a constant prickle, like a splinter lodged in his brain. It wasn't painful, not yet, but it was wrong, a sensation that made his vision shimmer at the edges, as if the world were warping. He avoided mirrors, but the urge to look was a compulsion, a need to know how much of himself remained. In the bathroom, under the flickering fluorescent light, he leaned close to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. His left eye was bloodshot, the pupil unnaturally wide, and the skin around it was pale, almost translucent, threaded with faint, dark veins that seemed to pulse faintly. He blinked, and for a moment, his reflection didn't, a split-second lag that sent a chill through his bones. The whisper was there, too, no longer in his ear but deeper, a soft, chittering Henry. Henry, that vibrated in his skull, like a moth trapped in a lantern. He tried to rebuild his life. He called his son, David, for the first time in years, leaving a voicemail that rambled about wanting to reconnect. The words felt clumsy, weighted with the guilt of a father who'd chosen silence over love. David didn't call back, and Henry didn't try again, the rejection settling like a stone in his chest. He went to the clinic for a follow-up, the sterile air sharp with disinfectant, but Dr. Hargrove's face was grim as he examined the scar. "Healing well," he said, but his hands trembled, and he avoided Henry's eyes, as if afraid of what he might see. The doctor mentioned tests, biopsies, but Henry waved them off, too tired, too afraid of what they might find. The itch in his eye flared as he left, a sharp, twisting sensation that made him stumble on the clinic steps. At home, the world felt quieter, but not peaceful. The rain fell endlessly, its patter against the windows heavy and deliberate, the drops glinting like oil under the streetlights. Henry sat in his recliner, the leather creaking, and tried to read a car magazine, but the words blurred, his vision wavering as the itch grew sharper. He pressed a finger to his temple, wincing as a faint, wet crack echoed in his skull, like a seed splitting open. The smell was back, faint, but unmistakable, a mix of rust and decay that seemed to rise from his own skin. He told himself it was over, that the creature was gone, but his body felt foreign, heavy, as if it were no longer entirely his. That night, Henry dreamed of a vast, dark plain, its ground slick and pulsing, like the inside of a living thing. Eyes blinked in the distance, hundreds of them, small and glossy, watching him with a hunger that wasn't human. The chittering voice was louder now, not words but a presence, wrapping around his thoughts like tendrils. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, and felt it, a faint movement behind his eye, a quick, skittering twitch that made his vision blur. He stumbled to the bathroom, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and metal, and forced himself to look in the mirror. His left eye was wrong, the pupil dilated to a black void, and as he stared, something moved beneath the surface, a tiny, segmented shape darting across the white of his eye, its legs glinting like needles. Henry froze, his breath shallow, the mirror fogging with his panic. The thing was still there, not in his ear but deeper, spreading, claiming more of him. The chittering grew louder, a chorus now, whispering his name in a language that felt ancient and wrong. He wanted to scream, to claw at his face, but his hands wouldn't move, heavy and unresponsive, as if they belonged to someone else. The reflection smiled, a slow, lipless grin, and the room seemed to shrink, the walls glistening with a faint grayish slime that smelled of his own decay. He backed away, tripping over the rug, and collapsed onto the floor, the cold linoleum pressing against his cheek. The rain outside was louder now, its rhythm unnatural, like the pulse of something vast and alive. Henry lay there, his body trembling, and realized he didn't know if he was fighting to live or to surrender. The itch in his eye pulsed, a promise of what was coming, and the whisper in his skull grew clearer, not just his name but a command. Join us. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind them alive with skittering shapes, and felt the last threads of himself unraveling. Morning came, gray and heavy, the rain still falling. Henry rose, his movements slow, mechanical, and went to the diner. He sat in his usual booth, the scar on his ear barely noticeable now, his face almost normal under the dim light. Carl waved, the waitress poured his coffee, and the world seemed to turn as it always had. But Henry's hand lingered on his temple, where the itch had settled, a faint, persistent prickle that promised more. He smiled, his left eye twitching slightly, and outside, the rain fell darker, its drops glinting like tiny, unblinking eyes. This final part concludes Henry's story with an open-ended resolution, blending temporary relief with lingering dread. The vivid imagery and oppressive atmosphere maintain the body horror, while the ambiguous ending leaves readers questioning whether Henry is free or forever changed. 3 months had passed since Henry Voss last saw the inside of Millfield's diner, its neon glow and grease-soaked air now a distant memory. The small Ohio town trudged on, its streets slick with the endless autumn rain that seemed to carry a metallic tang, as if the earth itself were rusting. Henry's clapboard house stood at the edge of town, its sagging roof patched with tarp, the windows fogged with condensation that never cleared. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and something sharper, like burnt wiring, a faint echo of the stench that had once poured from his ear. The scar on his left ear was a puckered knot, gray and lifeless, but it no longer wept or pulsed. The silence was worse, a hollow quiet that pressed against his skull, broken only by the drip of a faucet he'd fixed and then broken again, as if needing the sound to anchor him. Henry, now 66, moved through his days like a ghost in his own life. He tried to reclaim routine, brewing coffee in the chipped pot, flipping through car magazines whose pages curled with damp. But his hands trembled, his fingers brushing the scar absently, as if expecting it to stir. The itch behind his left eye had faded, but never fully left, a faint prickle, like a splinter lodged too deep to reach. His vision shimmered at times, the edges of the world warping, as if seen through warped glass. He avoided mirrors, covering them with towels or turning them to the wall, but the urge to look gnawed at him, a compulsion he fought and failed. At night, he'd stand in the bathroom, the fluorescent light flickering, and glimpse his reflection. Eyes bloodshot, the left pupil too wide, threaded with faint, dark veins that seemed to shift when he blinked. He hadn't spoken to Carl since the diner, dodging his calls until they stopped. The guilt was a weight, heavier than the silence from his son, David, whose voicemail Henry replayed in the dark, his own faltering words a reminder of bridges burned long ago. He tried writing a letter once, pen shaking over paper, but the words wouldn't come, and the page ended up crumpled in the trash, stained with coffee and a faint, sour smell he couldn't place. The town noticed his absence. The clerk at the corner store asked after him, her voice tinged with pity, and the waitress at the diner had stopped setting a place for him at his usual booth. Millfield felt smaller, its streets narrower, the rain heavier, as if the town were shrinking around him, or he around it. The clinic had called twice. Dr. Hargrove's voice clipped and uneasy, urging follow-up tests. Henry ignored them. The memory of the operating room, the scalpel's bite, the burst of acrid vapor, the writhing mass in the tray, haunted him, but so did the doctor's eyes, wide with something like fear. Henry didn't want answers. Not anymore. Answers meant facing what might still be inside him, what might have spread. The chittering whispers were gone, but their absence felt like a trap, a quiet too perfect, like the calm before a storm. He dreamed less now, but when he did, it was of tunnels, slick and pulsing, lined with eyes that watched without blinking, their gaze heavy with a hunger that felt like his own. One evening, as the rain fell in sheets, glinting like oil under the streetlights, Henry sat in his recliner, the leather creaking under his weight. The radio, unplugged since the worst nights, crackled faintly, a burst of static that sounded like a distant chitter. He froze, his hand on his temple, where the itch had flared again, sharper now, like a needle behind his eye. He stood, slow and deliberate, and walked to the bathroom. The mirror was uncovered, its surface streaked with condensation, reflecting a dim, yellowish glow from the flickering light. He leaned close, his breath fogging the glass, and stared into his left eye. The pupil was a black void, too large, and for a moment, something moved, a quick, darting shadow, like a leg skittering across a web. His heart thudded, but he didn't look away. The whisper came then, soft and rasping, not in his ear but deeper, in his bones. "Henry! We are." He stumbled back, the room spinning, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. The faucet dripped, a slow, metallic pulse, and the walls seemed to glisten, a faint sheen of grayish slime catching the light. Henry laughed, a brittle sound that broke into a cough, his throat tasting of copper and ash. He didn't know if he was fighting or surrendering, if the thing inside him was gone or merely waiting. He thought of David, of the letter he'd never sent, of the life he'd let slip through his fingers. The guilt was a parasite too, burrowing deeper than any insect, and he wondered if it had always been there, feeding on him long before the itch in his ear. The next morning, Henry walked to the diner, the rain lighter now, a soft drizzle that clung to his coat. The scar on his ear was hidden under a knit cap, his face almost normal in the gray light. He sat in his old booth, the vinyl creaking, and ordered coffee. The waitress smiled, hesitant, and Carl waved from across the room, his grin faltering as he saw Henry's eyes. The coffee was bitter, its aftertaste metallic, but Henry drank it anyway, his hand steady for the first time in months. Outside, the rain fell, its drops darker than they should be, glinting like tiny, unblinking eyes. He felt the prickle behind his eye, faint but persistent, and heard the whisper again, a soft Henry that might have been his own voice. He smiled, thin and brittle, and the world turned on, quiet but not at peace.